Ilara felt the cold not as a temperature, but as a presence. It was a patient creditor, waiting to collect on the debt of her warmth, her breath, her life. It had been 6 months since Liam's heart had given its last stubborn beat, and in that time, the world had systematically stripped her of everything that had once constituted a life. The farm, sold to cover debts she never knew existed. The truck, repossessed. The savings, a phantom that vanished into the ledgers of lawyers and bankers. All that remained was a folded piece of paper in her pocket, a deed to a plot of land so worthless it wasn't even worth the ink used to record its boundaries. 5 acres of rock-strewn timberland in the northernmost stretch of the county, a place the locals called the Giant's Graveyard. Liam had bought it for a song years ago, a romantic notion of building a cabin one day, a dream that, like him, was now buried. The land itself was an argument against hope. Gnarled pines, starved for light, clawed at a thin layer of acidic soil. Granite shoulders shrugged up through the earth, making a plow's work impossible and a foundation's a fool's errand. But its centerpiece, the very reason for its name and its worthlessness, was the stump. It was not the remnant of some ordinary tree. It was a monument to a forgotten age, the base of a colossal redwood that had been ancient when the first settlers arrived, and had likely been struck by lightning a century ago. The stump was a fortress, wider than the small house she and Liam had lost, and taller than 2 men. Its bark was a landscape of deep fissures and mossy valleys. The top was a jagged, splintered crown, but in its side a dark opening gaped like a wound. The hollow heart of the giant, burned out by the initial strike and slowly, patiently, being consumed by decay from within. To everyone else it was an obstruction, a colossal piece of natural debris that would cost a fortune to dynamite and haul away. It was the land's unmovable curse. To Ilara, standing before it with the autumn wind slicing through her thin coat, it was simply the end of the line. She had nowhere else to go. Her meager belongings were in a single bag at her feet, and the last of her money had paid for the bus ticket that dropped her at the county line, leaving her with a 5-mile walk to this final, desolate inheritance. The wind picked up, carrying the first premonition of snow. It was a hungry wind, promising a winter that would take no prisoners. Shivering, Ilara felt a profound and terrifying solitude. This was it, the sum of her life. A 28-year-old widow with a useless deed and a giant dead tree. She could lie down and let the cold take her, a quiet surrender. Or she could fight, but with what? She had no tools, no shelter, no plan. A week later the first visit came. A truck, far too clean for the muddy track leading to her property, ground to a halt. Silas, Liam's older brother, stepped out. He wore a crisp flannel shirt and an expression of practiced pity that didn't quite reach his eyes. His gaze swept over the land, not seeing the trees or the sky, but calculating angles and acreage. He saw the stump and sneered. He cleared his throat. "I came to see how you were settling in." Ilara didn't answer. She was sitting on a fallen log, nursing a small, smoky fire she'd managed to start with a book of matches and dry pine needles. Settling in was a generous term for what was, in effect, a slow and deliberate freezing. "Look, Ilara," Silas said, his tone shifting from false concern to business. "I know Liam left you in a bind. This place, it's nothing. But the logging company to the east needs access through here to their new parcel. They'll pay. Not a lot, but enough. I can get you a few hundred for the deed, enough to get a bus ticket somewhere warmer. Start over." She looked at him, her face smudged with soot, her eyes hollowed out by grief and exhaustion. "Liam loved this land," she said, her voice raspy. "Liam was a dreamer," he retorted, the pity evaporating completely. "He bought dirt and called it a future. I'm a realist. This is a dead end. And there's the matter of the note." "The note?" Ilara frowned. "The small mortgage he took out on it. From me." $1,000 for the taxes and fees. He never made a single payment. Silas pulled a folded paper from his jacket. It's not much, but business is business. The terms are simple. Payments start or the property reverts to the lender. Me. Let's just say you have until the first deep snow to make good on it. Otherwise, I foreclose. He offered a thin smile. Taking my offer is the smart play. It clears the debt and puts cash in your pocket. He didn't need to say the rest. He wanted her gone. He saw her as a liability, an embarrassment, a loose end from his brother's life that needed tidying. She was a woman alone, and in his world, that meant she was a problem to be managed or removed. "I'll think about it," she said, the words tasting like ash. "Don't think too long," he said, climbing back into his truck. "Winter doesn't wait." The way he said it, it sounded less like a fact of nature and more like a threat. After he left, the silence that descended was heavier than before. He had taken her desperation and put a deadline on it. The first deep snow. In this part of the country, that could be weeks or it could be days. He had left her with an impossible choice: surrender her last connection to Liam for a pittance, or be thrown off it with nothing at all. The cold seemed to bite deeper, the presence at her back now wearing Silas's sneering face. She huddled closer to the fire, its meager warmth a fleeting comfort against the vast, encroaching chill. That night, as an icy rain began to fall, she abandoned the sputtering fire and sought refuge from the wind. She crawled into the only shelter the land offered, the dark, hollow opening in the great stump. Inside, the world changed. The sound of the wind tearing through the pines was muffled to a distant sigh. The air, thick with the scent of rich humus, damp earth, and ancient decaying wood, was profoundly still. And it was warmer. Not warm, but warmer. The biting edge of the cold was gone, shaved off by the sheer mass of the wood surrounding her. She pressed a hand against the curved inner wall. It was cool and damp, but it did not radiate the piercing cold of the granite stones outside. It was a barrier, a shield. In that moment of quiet observation, a memory surfaced, unbidden. It was of her grandfather, a man of few words and calloused hands. A man who seemed to understand the world through his senses rather than through books. He'd been digging a root cellar on their farm, and a young Alara had asked why he was burying their food. He had paused, wiped his brow, and pointed a dirt-caked finger at the ground. "The earth has a long memory, Ellie girl," he'd said. "It remembers the summer sun right through the winter. Go 10 feet down, and the seasons don't matter much. It's always cool in the heat, and it never freezes in the cold. It holds its own. The earth holds its own." She looked around the vast, dark interior of the stump. The walls were feet thick, a dense weave of cellulose and time. Below her, the ground was a soft mix of rotted wood and soil. An idea so audacious and born of such sheer desperation that it felt like madness began to form. Everyone, including Silas, saw the stump as an obstacle to be removed. They thought in terms of building on the land. What if they were wrong? What if the solution wasn't to build on it, but within it? To go down, not up, to use the giant's corpse not as a problem, but as the solution. To carve a home not out of new lumber, but out of the very thing everyone had dismissed as waste. The plan was terrifyingly simple. She would dig. She would hollow out the soft, punky heartwood and excavate the earth beneath, creating a pit house sheltered by the stump's impenetrable walls. She would go down into the earth, into its long memory of warmth. It was a mole's logic, a badger's instinct. It was an idea that would make them call her mad. But it was also the only idea she had. The next morning, she walked the 5 miles back into the small town of Northwood. It was a place that ran on convention and quiet judgment. Her presence, a lone woman walking the shoulder of the highway, drew curtains aside and prompted hushed conversations over coffee cups at the diner. She ignored them. She had a singular focus. Her destination was Abernathy's Hardware, a town institution run by a man as old and seemingly permanent as the building itself. Mr. Abernathy was a kind man, but a practical one. He had known Liam, and he looked at Alara with an expression of genuine, sorrowful pity. When she walked in, he was dusting a shelf of galvanized buckets. "Morning, Alara. Heard you were staying out at the old giant's graveyard. Tough piece of land." "I need some tools," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "A shovel, a pickaxe, and a good lantern." He stopped dusting and gave her a long, searching look. "Doing some clearing, are you?" "Something like that." He led her to the back of the store, the air thick with the smell of oil, metal, and sawdust. He showed her a sturdy shovel with an ash handle and a heavy-headed pick. He lit a wick on a large kerosene lantern, its light casting a warm, steady glow. "This will all come to $17, he said gently. Alara's face fell. She had exactly $4 and some change in her pocket. I don't have it right now. But I'm good for it. I will be." Abernathy sighed, a long, slow exhalation of air. He looked at her blistered hands, the defiant set of her jaw. He knew about Silas. In a town this small, everyone knew everything. He knew Silas was waiting for her to fail. He suspected this flurry of activity was just grief, a final, futile thrashing before the inevitable. "What are you really doing out there, girl?" he asked, his voice low. "I'm building a house," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. He blinked. "On that land? There's not a flat spot big enough for a decent outhouse. And that stump." "Not on it," she said. "In it." The old man was silent for a long time. He looked from her determined face to the heavy tools, and a flicker of something, disbelief, amusement, concern, crossed his features. He saw the madness of the idea, the sheer, back-breaking folly of it, but he also saw the glint of something else in her eyes, a core of iron that grief had not rusted away. It was the same look he'd seen in the eyes of homesteaders from a generation past, people who'd had nothing but grit and a refusal to be beaten. He shook his head slowly. He ran a hand over his bald scalp. "All right," he said finally. "Take the tools. You can start a tab. But you listen to me. That stump's been rotting for 100 years. It's full of termites and carpenter ants and who knows what else. You be careful. Don't you go digging your own grave." The phrase echoed Silas's sentiment, but the tone was entirely different. Where Silas's words were a curse, Abernathy's were a warning, laced with a reluctant, paternal care. "I won't," she promised. "Thank you, Mr. Abernathy." Carrying the heavy tools, she walked the 5 miles back. The weight was immense, but it was a good weight. It was the weight of purpose. The labor began that afternoon. She lit the lantern, its golden light pushing back the deep gloom inside the stump's hollow. The interior was a cavern of crumbling reddish-brown wood. It was soft, spongy in places, the work of a century of moisture and insects. She swung the pickaxe. It bit deep, sinking into the decayed heartwood with a satisfying, pulpy thud. She shoveled the debris into one of the buckets Abernathy had insisted she take, hauled it to the opening, and dumped it outside. The first day, she cleared a space barely large enough to stand upright. Her back screamed. Her hands, soft from a life that hadn't required this kind of work, were raw and blistered by sunset. But as she sat outside, chewing on a piece of dry bread, she looked at the growing pile of reddish mulch next to the stump. It was progress. It was tangible. It was a denial of Silas's verdict. Days bled into a week, then 2. Her life found a new brutal rhythm. Wake with the sun, eat a meager breakfast, work until her muscles trembled with exhaustion, sleep. The pile of excavated mulch grew into a small mountain. She worked her way down, clearing the rotted wood until she hit solid, damp earth. Then the real work began. The shovel became an extension of her arms. The pickaxe was her percussion instrument, striking the rocky soil with a steady, metronomic beat. Bucket by bucket, she descended into the ground. The town's whispers grew louder. The school bus driver reported seeing her, day after day, disappearing into the stump like an animal into its burrow. Children started calling her the Stump Widow. Rumors spread that she had lost her mind to grief, that she was communing with spirits, that she was digging for some mythical treasure. The story became a piece of local folklore in the making. Silas drove by once a week, a smug ritual. He never got out of the truck. He'd just slow down, look at the growing mound of dirt, shake his head with a theatrical smirk, and drive off. He saw a woman engaged in a pointless, insane task. He saw his own victory drawing nearer with every bucket she hauled. He didn't see the hole she was digging, couldn't comprehend its purpose. He just saw the waste product of her madness. One afternoon, Mr. Abernathy's truck rattled up the track. He got out carrying a large thermos. He didn't say much. He just watched her for a while as she emerged from the opening, covered in dirt, her face streaked with sweat despite the autumn chill. "Brought you some coffee," he said, handing her the thermos. "It's getting cold." "Thank you," she said, her hands trembling slightly as she took it. The warmth of the metal cup was a small miracle. He peered into the dark opening. "How far down are you?" "About 6 feet," she answered. "Another 4 to go." He shook his head again, the gesture now more one of bafflement than pity. "You're a stubborn woman, Alara. I'll give you that. Stubborn as this granite." He looked up at the sky, which was the color of old pewter. "Snow's coming. The radio says it's a big one. An Arctic front pushing down from Canada. They're saying it could be the worst in 20 years. "I know," she said. "I'm running out of time." He looked at her, then at the hole, then back at her. He seemed to be wrestling with something. "You're going to need a roof. And a stove. A hole in the ground won't keep you from freezing if you don't have a way to cap it and heat it." "I know," she repeated quietly. "One step at a time." He left without another word, but the next day he returned. In the bed of his truck were several sheets of salvaged corrugated tin, a small pot-bellied stove with a rusty but intact flue pipe, and a box of non-perishable food. "Found these in the back of the warehouse," he said gruffly, avoiding her eyes. "Just taking up space. You might as well have them. The stove needs a bit of cleaning, but it draws well." Tears welled in Alara's eyes, mixing with the grime on her cheeks. She didn't know what to say. It was more than just charity. It was a vote of confidence. A skeptical one, perhaps, but a vote nonetheless. He didn't believe in her vision, not yet, but he had begun to believe in her will. He had become her first and only ally. Together they worked to install a rudimentary roof over the opening she'd created. They framed a small square with scavenged lumber and laid the tin sheets over it, leaving a hole for the stovepipe. They lowered the small stove into the 10 by 10 foot chamber she had carved out of the earth. The floor was packed dirt. The walls were the thick, curving wood of the stump, scarred by her pickaxe but solid as rock. It wasn't a house. It was a den, a burrow. But it was hers. The first snowflakes began to fall the day they finished. They were large, wet flakes that melted on the ground. But they were a harbinger. Silas appeared that afternoon, a legal-looking document in his hand. "Well, that's it," he announced, stepping out of his truck and gesturing at the sky. "First snow. As per our agreement." He held out the foreclosure notice. "The property is mine. I'll give you 24 hours to collect your things and be on your way." Mr. Abernathy stepped forward. "Now hold on, Silas. This isn't a deep snow. It's barely sticking." "Deep enough for me," Silas sneered. "A deal's a deal." She had her chance. He looked past Abernathy at Alara, who stood in the entrance to her stump, her face grim. "I tried to help you. I offered you a fair price. You chose to do this. To dig a hole like a gopher. Now you have nothing." The radio in his truck was on, a weather bulletin crackling through the static. Downgraded to a blizzard warning for the entire region. "We are now forecasting a historic cold event. Temperatures are expected to plummet overnight, reaching lows not seen in this state since 1934. All residents are advised to shelter in place and prepare for extended power outages." Silas's smug expression wavered for a fraction of a second. He glanced at the sky, then back at Alara. He didn't care. The weather only solidified his position. She would never survive a night like that out here. He was, in his own mind, saving her from her own foolishness. 24 hours, he repeated, his voice hard. "Then I'm coming back with the sheriff." He got in his truck and drove away, his tires spinning in the thin layer of accumulating slush. Abernathy turned to Alara, his face etched with worry. "He's right about one thing. This storm is going to be a monster. Are you sure you'll be safe in there? You can come stay with me and my wife in town." Alara looked at the small, sturdy shelter she had clawed from the earth. She had a stove, a pile of dry firewood she'd gathered, and a box of food. And she had the stump. She had the earth. "This is my home now," she said. "I'll be fine. Thank you for everything." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "All right then. Be safe." He drove off, his truck's red taillights disappearing into the thickening snow, leaving her once again in profound solitude. But this time it was different. She was not a victim waiting for the end. She was a fortress waiting for a siege. By nightfall, the world had vanished into a vortex of white. The wind shrieked, a physical, malevolent force that slammed against the forest, snapping branches and tearing at anything that wasn't rooted deep. The temperature plunged. It fell past 0, then 10 below, then 20. In town, the power grid failed. Houses went dark and cold. Pipes, even those that had been wrapped and insulated, began to freeze, then burst with reports like rifle shots. The townsfolk, who had all the modern conveniences, were suddenly thrown back into a primal struggle against the cold. They huddled under blankets, their breath fogging in their own living rooms, feeding precious furniture into fireplaces as their woodpiles dwindled. Silas, in his large, modern house with its vaulted ceilings and picture windows, felt the cold first as an inconvenience, then as an invasion. His generator failed. The pipes in the kitchen burst, flooding the floor with water that quickly began to glaze over with ice. He and his wife retreated to a single room, barricading the door with towels, their fear growing with every degree the thermometer dropped. The house, a symbol of his success and practicality, was arguing with the wind, and it was losing. Miles away inside the ancient stump, Alara was warm. She had lit a small fire in the pot-bellied stove. The little iron box glowed with a dull, cherry-red heat. But it wasn't just the stove. The chamber itself seemed to hold the warmth. The immense thermal mass of the surrounding earth and the foot-thick wooden walls acted as a massive insulator. The shrieking of the wind was a distant, almost pleasant murmur. There were no drafts. The air was still and calm. The temperature inside her den hovered at a comfortable 60 degrees. She cooked a can of soup on the stove, the smell of it filling her small, secure world. She was not merely surviving. She was comfortable. She had listened to the earth, and it had kept its promise. The storm raged for 2 days. On the morning of the third day, the wind died, and a strange crystalline silence fell over the landscape. The world was buried under 4 feet of snow, sculpted by the wind into alien drifts and dunes. The temperature was still a brutal 15 below zero. It was in this silence that Mr. Abernathy's ordeal began. A massive, snow-laden pine branch, weakened by the cold, had cracked and fallen, crushing a section of his roof. Snow poured into his attic. His furnace, already struggling, gave up completely. Within hours, his own house was becoming uninhabitable. His wife was bundled by the fireplace, but their wood was almost gone. They were in real danger. And then, through his worry, he thought of Alara. He thought of her hole in the ground, of her stubbornness, of her quiet confidence. He thought of it as a fool's hope, but it was the only hope he had. He bundled himself in every layer he owned and set out. The journey was a nightmare. He waded through waist-deep drifts, the cold burning his lungs. It took him over an hour to cover the half-mile to her property line. He was exhausted, his hope dwindling, certain he was on his way to find a frozen corpse. He saw the stump, a snow-covered mound almost indistinguishable from the surrounding landscape. There was no sign of life. His heart sank. He had sent her to her death. He trudged closer, his legs heavy, preparing himself for what he would find. And then he saw it. A thin, almost invisible wisp of gray smoke, rising from a narrow pipe sticking out of the snow. It rose straight up into the mercilessly cold air, a fragile but defiant signal of life. He stumbled to the mound and began digging at the snow where he remembered the door being. "Alara!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Alara, are you in there?" The snow shifted. A small, sturdy wooden door, the one she had fashioned from fallen timber, swung inward. Alara stood there, silhouetted against a soft, warm light. She was wearing a simple sweater, her face calm. A wave of air, not hot, but profoundly, blessedly warm and still, washed over him. It was the warmest air he had felt in 2 days. He stared, speechless. The interior was simple, almost primitive, yet it felt like the safest place on earth. The little stove glowed contentedly. A kettle was steaming on its surface. He stumbled inside, out of the wind, and the shock of the transition from the brutal cold to this gentle warmth almost brought him to his knees. He looked around at the curved wooden walls, the earthen floor, the quiet efficiency of it all. It was not the den of a madwoman. It was a masterpiece of pragmatic design. "How?" was all he could manage to say, his breath fogging in the warm air. "The earth holds its own," she said simply, handing him a steaming mug of tea. He sank onto a small wooden crate, the warmth seeping into his frozen bones. He looked at her, at this woman they had all pitied and mocked, and he saw not a widow but an architect. Not a fool, but a prophet. He took a sip of the hot tea. "I'll be damned," he whispered, shaking his head in utter, humbling awe. The deal was done. He was her first convert. When the thaw finally came and the roads were cleared, the town of Northwood emerged to count the cost. The damage was catastrophic. Dozens of homes were unlivable. The financial toll was in the hundreds of thousands. It was in the midst of this communal misery that Silas drove his damaged truck, now equipped with chains, out to Alara's land. He was coming not just with the sheriff, but with a righteous fury. He was going to enjoy throwing this foolish woman off the land that had, in his mind, been rightfully his all along. He found not one person but two. Mr. Abernathy stood beside Alara, and they were working together, reinforcing the roof structure with new lumber. Abernathy's truck was parked nearby, a clear sign of allegiance. "What is this?" Silas demanded, storming towards them. "I told you to be gone. This property is mine." Abernathy, a man Silas had known and respected his entire life, calmly set down his hammer and turned to face him. "You'd be wise to leave her be, Silas. I have a legal document," he sputtered, waving the foreclosure notice, which was now wrinkled and damp. "You have a piece of paper," Abernathy countered, his voice steady and cold as the winter air. "She has the only home in this county that came through the freeze without a scratch. My own house has $10,000 in damage. Yours, I hear, is even worse. This place she built is the warmest, safest structure for 50 miles. Now, I don't know what your piece of paper says, but common sense says the person who can survive out here is the one who belongs here." Silas was left speechless. He looked from Abernathy's implacable face to Alara's quiet composure. He looked at the humble, smoking pipe rising from the stump. He saw the truth in Abernathy's words. His own modern home had failed him. Her primitive hole in the ground had triumphed. It defied all logic, all convention. His authority, built on money and legal documents, meant nothing in the face of it. Defeated, not by law but by a reality he could not deny, he crumpled the paper in his fist, turned without another word, and left for good. The story of what happened next became the new folklore of Northwood. The tale of the Stump widow was replaced by the legend of the Stump house. People came to see it. At first they came out of curiosity, to gawk at the strange dwelling. But they left with a sense of wonder. They felt the steady, earth-given warmth. They saw the simple, undeniable genius of the design. They stopped seeing Alara as the crazy woman and began to see her as a survivor, an innovator. That spring, as families struggled to repair their broken homes, they started coming to her for a different reason. For advice. She never charged a penny. She showed them the principles her grandfather had taught her, and that desperation had forced her to apply. She taught them about the thermal stability of the earth, about using natural landscape features as shields against the wind, about building smaller, more efficient, partially subterranean structures that worked with the environment rather than fighting it. She paid off Silas's old note at the county clerk's office, with money she earned helping Abernathy rebuild his hardware store. Years passed. The Stump House, which came to be known as the Abernathy House in honor of her first and most loyal ally, became a permanent fixture. Alara added a small, glassed-in greenhouse to its south-facing side, allowing her to grow vegetables nearly year-round. She never grew rich, but she was secure. She had carved a life out of a place no one wanted, built a home out of something everyone had discarded. Decades later, long after Alara and Mr. Abernathy were gone, the region was known for its unique and resilient architecture. The lessons of the Great Freeze of '34 had been absorbed into the local consciousness. Many homes were built with deep cellars and earth-sheltered walls, a quiet testament to the woman who had first dared to dig down. The Stump House itself became a local landmark, a protected piece of history. It stood as a silent monument not to grand ambition or wealth, but to the profound power of seeing things differently. It was a lesson written in earth and wood, that the greatest treasures are often disguised as burdens, and the most profound wisdom is often whispered by the quiet, ancient voices of the world, audible only to those who are desperate enough or humble enough to listen. The value was never in the land itself, but in the courage to see a home where everyone else had only seen a grave.